SciAnts. We get experimental science. We're curious, non-judgmental.
Correct answer, chat, is and always will be this little guy. They actually discovered 2 new species of this. Correct answer is a hedgehog. Guys, let's get into the details of the paper. So, did you know that there are species of hedgehog that are not spiky? They are soft-haired hedgehogs, which apparently are a thing. I did not know this. So these are soft fur hedgehogs. I assumed that hedgehogs, by definition of their name, hedge, were spiky. But no, there are actually many species of soft fur hedgehogs. And actually, in this study, they used molecular data. So they did a ton of sequencing. They did sequencing from the mitochondrial genome. They did sequencing from the nuclear genome as well. They did museum specimens. They also caught live animals. And they ended up describing 2 brand new species of the soft fur hedgehog. And then they also shifted. This is where it gets a little bit tenuous, I think. There were 3 species that were considered originally as subspecies, which just means they're just like a very close relative to the existing species, right? They were elevated to a full species, meaning that they, with all the extra sequencing that they did in the study, all this extra sequencing led them to say, you know what, these are actually new species as well. So there were 2 that were brand new that had been never described before, and then another 3 that were elevated from the rank of subspecies to a full-on species in this study. But this is the actual paper. Were named after their favorite habitat. Cliff, they might be. I always thought, Cliff, it's because they looked like they were hedgy. Like someone didn't quite clip the hedges appropriately and they got a little spikiness to them. It might totally not at all be the case of that. I don't actually know. We can look it up, chat. Where did hedgehogs get their name? The name hedgehog comes to use in around 1450, derived from the Middle English hedgehog, from hedge, because it frequents hedgerows. You are correct, Cliff. Oh, and hog from its pig-like snout. So there's 2 components of it, Cliff. Middle English, split from the hedges from where it lives, and hog from its pig-like snout. On what basis are they considered a hedgehog? So on this one, it's a lot of molecular evidence. So in terms of the sequencing, what is the genetic similarity most close to? They fall under the very same family as other like spiky hedgehogs. The only big fundamental differences in the genetics, like beyond that they can't interbreed, is that like what their hair makeup is made like. So that's where there's been that variance in terms of evolutionary time. So, but in terms of like what exactly, like how do they decide the original hedgehog? My bet is that it was originally the hard hair ones, and then this came afterwards for the molecular definitions of it. Now, there's been so many hedgehogs described, even of these soft fur ones, that there's actually been this idea of subspecies, meaning that there are subcategories of existing species. But here they did 2 kinds of sequencing in this study, and they were able to parse out that no, in fact, these all belong to very, very different groups. So what these soft fur hedgehogs are very small mammals, and they are very close relatives of these hedgehogs. They're not rodents, and one big delineating factor between these rows is the nose. So if you look at the nose, they still have this very snout-like structure to them that's very, very different from some of the existing ones that we've seen in the past, if that makes sense. They're just very different looking than what we're used to, like what any other kind of rodent would have. They did compare some lifestyle similarities and differences with the existing hedgehog population that we know we have. So further on in the paper, what else did they find? They found that they did do some ecological work on them to figure out, okay, what do these animals normally do? They found that they are most active during the day, and then occasional night behavior, there is activity, but mostly during the day, which is unique to them. They are omnivorous, so they eat both fruits, insects, invertebrates, pretty much all the kinds of things on there. And yes, Rose, that is a great question. The defense mechanism for the hard-haired hedgehogs, right, is that hard hair. So Rose, one thing in the paper really isn't talked about is what is the manner in which that these animals actually end up defending themselves. They talk about like what the animals look like. They're like, even a quote from one of the scientists on the paper, the quote is, "Without the spines of their more well-known cousins, soft fur hedgehogs superficially looks like a mixture of a mouse and a shrew with a short tail." And it's like, that's pretty much all we get on terms of like that look and that difference. And I do wonder, it's like, all right, well, how do they protect themselves? There must be some difference there, right? What is the change for the variance? So yeah, that's a great question to know. So the way they were able to do this, they actually looked at both museum specimens and they looked at like live caught specimens as well. And they actually looked at 232 different individuals, which is, I think, a really nice sample number. And they took tissue samples and sequenced from their own field collecting as well as museum specimens, and the specimens that they sequenced from spanned everywhere from Europe, Asia, the United States. So this is what isn't highlighted in the start of this paper, Cliff, is that they're basically redefining the phylogenetics of these animals. Like, this is I don't know, may or may not sound strange, but there has never been such a deep-rooted sequencing push for hedgehogs anywhere in the known literature. And so they not only sequenced the species that they thought they identified, but they sequenced all surrounding species as well, what they suspected in the phylogenetic tree, so they can have comparisons. So I'm kind of surprised it's only in this journal. Like, this journal is very, very niche, the zoological journal, the Linnean Society. Like, it's very, very specific. We've read stuff from there before, and usually the tier kind of paper that we get from this is they measured a bunch of physical attributes and said that the animals were different, and that's kind of where it ends. And if you get any sequencing, it might be that they sequence one gene. Rose, that's not too crazy. Usually the one gene that, or a couple of genes that are sequenced are ones that are under heavy selection pressure, so there's a lot of variance between individual species of that gene or a couple of genes, so it's usually a good insight if it's a different species. But here, they did over 200 sequencing experiments. On these tissue samples, they did both mitochondrial sequencing as well as whole genome sequencing. They did physical observations and measurements on all of the samples, everything from the size of the skull, teeth number, type of fur, and everything else on that. Yeah, Saphira's mama, does that surprise you? It surprised me, and maybe it should, but I still have this naivete sometimes that I feel like these are basic enough things that we should have already known. Like, this almost seems like this should have been a study like almost 10 years ago, right? Like, where this paper, like the current iteration should be something like, oh, we're figuring out what the genes are that are controlling the hard hair growth, right? Like, that's where I'm almost expecting the data to be. So I'm considering this, Rose, as like a foundational push onto this group of animals. Yeah, exactly, right? Saphira's mom, like, it's like most animals I feel like we know far more of. And like this, maybe one way to interpret it, Saphira's mama, is that they needed to redo the data to make it much better. Because maybe the existing data sets were so poor that you needed to do essentially an overhaul of the data to be able to make any kind of interpretation of what they were actually able to find. That is my suspicion on it. There is no background really on here that like throws shade at the existing data. It was just a really, again, like the fact that they went almost above and beyond there. What else did these scientists do with our hedgehog species? So learn a little bit more about them. They did find that there are many different distinct lineages in the group of the hedgehog, including, right, there's like over 7 that they identified, and this increases the number of species by over 5, again, like what they were saying in the data. The 2 of the new species, like the brand new ones, are called Hylomix vorax and Hylomix macarong. They are endemic, so those are like the 2 brand new species that are identified here in this study. The other 3, again, were formerly considered to be subspecies of the Hylomix Sulius. Again, I have never idea if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but all 3 showed a ton of genetic difference and apparently physical differences too. So Rose, one interesting thing is with the subspecies, they looked back at the existing data, that measurements that were taken when originally describing them as a different species or as a subspecies, and it turns out there were actually a bunch of measurements missing. And so to account for that, they did a bunch of brand new measurements, and the measurements are parsing out in a way where it's like, all right, these are clearly different enough where we should list them as a different species. Like, we may do research on the animal and we may know their habitat, behavior, size, etc. Not until we see their DNA. Absolutely. And Saphira's mom, where it was really cool to me, is that they did both the nuclear DNA as well as the mitochondrial. Dandy him. Not at all, silly goose. That's a great question. They live in this particular area. So these hedgehogs live in this northern Sumatra, southern Vietnam area regularly. So that's where they normally live, Dan. So it'd be like endemic versus invasive would be the opposite of it. Yeah. So yeah, I thought again it was super cool that they had that, and they looked at so many different kinds of sequencing. They said they kind of gave an out as to why in the past studies there may have been difficulty in terms of identifying them as different species. They did say a lot of these hedgehogs are nocturnal, and if you're catching them in the field and trying to do on-field measurements, you might be just like in the dark, you're just not doing everything fast enough, or maybe even thoroughly enough on the point where like the being nocturnal might, throw off your measurements. I don't know how, I have not done field work at night, so I'm not sure like what the standard protocol is, but I thought that was like a neat aside that they mentioned on there. Yeah. Naturalized when an animal isn't native endemic, not necessarily invasive, but they've established a self-sustaining population. Yeah. Actually, we can look at the map. There's a figure here in the paper, Dan, of showing where these animals are located. Here are the samples that they collected from, like the wild caught ones, so you can see where about the animals are. See, they did the morphological data, the statistical analysis as well. Like they went above and beyond, I thought. Here is the new phylogeny cliff. They didn't show the before one cliff, but I like how this one turned out. Like this figure is really pretty. So here are all the different species listed out, and you can see all of these H's. There's this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're adding into it, and then they're mapping along the location where the animals are located, so that you can match against the map and see, okay, these are in the Sumatran region, these are in Malaysian region, these are in this one particular inset right here. And it's just really neat to see, like, you're linking up the phylogeny based on the differences between the genetics, but then also you can see on the same graph the geographical distribution between the animals. And Cliff, I don't know how you feel about it, but tell me, I like this presentation of phylogeny a lot, especially when you're trying to present data suggesting there's new species or even existing ones. So before this paper, there really wasn't this level of detail on these animals. Some more of the genetic comparisons between the animals, you can see there's a strong difference and gap in them. This is the morphology analysis. So this I thought was another really pretty slide. They took each of these different colors are different species, 2 different panels, and they did measurements on them, and you can see they cluster pretty distinctly. All this is like feature measurement, like let's say the dorsal skull crane measurement, something along those lines. And then you're seeing here, this is species 1, species 2, species 3. And they separate out pretty well, and there's a tiny bit of overlap, but not much. Apparently the reason not mouse-like is because of the snout. The snout is very representative of what a classic hedgehog is. So apparently that's like the difference of it. And they do make a very important point that it's not related to the rodent family. So it's its own distinct structure, an own distinct group. So, and here again is just another way of measuring certain morphological features, the structural measurements, and you see the colors separate out. So it's like they did their measurements really well, which is, I'm like, hats off to them for doing such a good job on this. There's a ton of data on all of these different species in here. We also get to some measurements too, like here's the actual animal, like these are the holotype samples, so these are what you compare against in the future. They had ones from museums they measured as well as wild caught ones. Same thing with the cranial elements of it. So here are like 2 different species of them, and you can actually see some differences in like the eye sockets pretty reliably. So this orbital structure and the bone looks different between the animals, the mandibular ones. Like it's a really clean, like well done paper. They even went into like the details in the paper of the location where the animals were found. Like they give longitude and latitude measurements. Like they were like etymology of the name they put in. Like I've never seen something like that. It's like really, like they just did and put in every single possible thing on in here. Again, here's further comparison of structures, male and female differences too that they measured. The back of the cranium, which is a diagnostic area of difference, they pointed out like the figures zoomed in images too. I'm just like, hats off to y'all. And then Rose, this was a really interesting image to add in. This is a photo from 1939, and this is the first description of catching one of these short hair, soft furred hedgehogs in the area. And it's a little bit difficult to see, but there's the hedgehog in this researcher's hand. Apparently not expired. They made a point of that in the figure legend. But it was just like, we found it, this particular one as well, in the same similar area, and it had this interesting historical finish to it. I'm not used to seeing anything like that, honestly, in any study. I can't remember or ever tell you the last time I've seen some kind of a historical context to that, but they had that kind of picture here. It gave him like the picture credits for it and everything. I was like, well done, y'all. They talk a little about conservation efforts, and they do mention that and this is the unfortunate thing, so y'all, sometimes when we've done these papers, what we actually end up finding is that the animals are already endangered upon description as a new species. They did mention in this particular study that they're not sure if it's endangered already or not. And the reason for that is that they're not sure is because they even went into, like, we have not gone over enough of the area, and they also mentioned the effectiveness of decentralized forest governance in Indonesia. So talking about the geopolitical climate of the certain areas where these animals are located, they're like, even if we did a survey of one particular area, we cannot give an appropriate estimation because of how, like, essentially ineffective the protections are against these animals. But yeah, that I thought was like a nice, interesting addition to it as well. They talked about, further conservation efforts of all of these animals that they identified on these 5, kind of summarizing all the difference in the molecular data. And their conclusion, they address the systematics of this particular species through an integrative approach combining next-generation museum genomics, traditional craniodental morphometrics, present evidence supporting recognition of 2 new species, and the elevation of 3 species from subspecies to specific species status. Our findings support that northern and southern Annamites as centers of localized endemicity suggest the additional need for small mammal surveys across the Sumatra's Baresian range. They have me convinced. I thought they did a beautiful job in this study, and like, hats off to them on multiple different fronts on this for having like the insane amount of depth to this. So they also had a huge acknowledgments list, and it was really cool to see. They even acknowledged things like, a lot of the measurements that they did in museums, for example. Those museum curators aren't necessarily on the paper because they just got access to the samples, and then they actually went in and said, like, in their acknowledgments, like, this was a museum curator that helped us, and so, like, they went through and like really highlighted and celebrated all the people that helped them out and helped them get to this point in the paper. So yeah, I thought it was really cool. I really liked it. Hopefully y'all like them as well.